55 years, not a crack. How could Jim and Jesse survive 55 years in the most ruthless business in the world? How could Jesse do that to his own brother without tearing each other apart? Are we witnessing a miracle of loyalty? Or are we witnessing two of the greatest liars in country music history? Is their greatest achievement not their music, but their ability to bury the truth? To truly understand the source of Jim and Jesse's unique harmony, you must first travel back in time and place to the land that forged them, a land of profound and often brutal contradictions, the Appalachian Mountains of Southwest Virginia in the 1920s. This was and still is a place of staggering, almost mythic, natural beauty. Ancient rolling mountains covered in a dense blanket of hardwood trees, shrouded in a perpetual blue-gray mist that gives the Blue Ridge its name. Deep, shadowed valleys, or hollers, are carved by creeks and rivers, where the sunlight struggles to reach the valley floor until midday. It is a landscape that inspires both awe and a sense of deep, abiding isolation. But beneath that surface of scenic splendor lay a world of backbreaking poverty and systemic hardship. For generations, life here was dictated by two unforgiving rhythms: the ancient cycle of subsistence farming on small rocky plots of land, and the newer, more dangerous pulse of the coal industry. By the time the McReynolds brothers were born, coal was king, and it was a tyrannical ruler. The mountains were laced with seams of bituminous coal, and large mining corporations had come to extract this wealth, transforming the region's economy and its very culture. Small, unincorporated communities known as coal camps sprang up in the narrow valleys, built and owned entirely by the mining companies. Places like Carfax, Virginia, near the slightly larger town of Coburn, where the McReynolds family lived. In these towns, the company owned the houses the miners rented, the store where their families bought groceries, the doctor who treated their injuries, and even the church where they prayed. It was a system of near-total economic control, a form of industrial feudalism that kept generations of families perpetually in debt and tied to the mines. The work itself was brutally dangerous. Men would descend into the dark, dangerous belly of the earth, as the old songs called it, for 10 or 12 hours a day. They faced the constant, imminent threats of roof collapses, methane gas explosions, and the slow, creeping death of black lung disease, a debilitating respiratory illness caused by inhaling coal dust. Every day when the mine whistle blew, the women and children left on the surface waited with a gnawing anxiety, praying their husbands, fathers, and brothers would emerge from the darkness covered in a thick layer of black dust, but otherwise whole. It was into this world that the McReynolds brothers were born. James Monroe McReynolds, the elder, arrived on February 13, 1927. His younger brother, Jesse Lester McReynolds, followed 2 years later on July 9, 1929. They were the sons of Charles McReynolds Jr. and Meta McReynolds. Charles was a man who embodied the dual existence of the Appalachian male. He was a farmer and a coal miner. He worked his own small plot of land, coaxing what he could from the unforgiving Virginia soil. But the farm alone could not sustain a family. And so, like his father and neighbors, he would also take his lamp and pick and descend into the mines to earn a cash wage, a dangerous but necessary supplement. He was a quiet, hard-working man, respected by his peers, a man who understood the value of a day's labor, whether it was under the sun or deep beneath the earth. Their mother, Meta, was the heart of the home, a woman of quiet, steadfast faith. She was the one who nurtured the family's spiritual and emotional life. Her voice was a familiar and comforting sound, though in the local Methodist church, filling the small, simple wooden chapel with the sound of the gospel hymns that formed the bedrock of their musical education. She was the keeper of the family's moral compass, instilling in her sons a sense of decency, humility, and faith that would define their characters for the rest of their lives. Their childhood was a study in scarcity. They were children of the Great Depression, an economic catastrophe that hit the already impoverished Appalachian region with particular ferocity. They knew the reality of a life lived on the very edge of subsistence. They wore clothes made from flour sacks, often went barefoot in the summer, and understood that waste was not an option. Luxuries were non-existent. But this hardship bred a certain kind of resilience and creativity. When you have little, you learn to make the most of what you have. For the McReynolds family, and for countless others in the mountains, the one thing they had in abundance was music. Music in Appalachia was not a commodity or form of passive entertainment. It was a vital, living part of the cultural fabric. It was a repository of history, a way of passing down stories from one generation to the next. It was a source of entertainment at community gatherings, barn dances, and corn shuckings. It was a tool for worship in the church, a way to connect with the divine. And perhaps most importantly, it was a balm for the soul, one of the few sources of transcendent joy and beauty in a world defined by relentless, grinding hardship. After a long, dangerous day in the mines, a man could pick up a fiddle or a banjo and, for a few hours, be transported. In the McReynolds household, however, music was something even more profound. It was a birthright. It was in their blood, a legacy stretching back through generations. And it connected them, by a remarkable twist of fate, to the very moment their genre was born. Their paternal grandfather, Charles McReynolds Sr., was a well-respected local fiddler. He wasn't a professional musician in the modern sense. He was a working man like everyone else. But he was the man you called on when you needed music for a dance or a social event. He played the old-time tunes that had been passed down from Irish, Scottish, and English ancestors, melodies that had crossed the Atlantic and mutated in the isolation of the mountains into a uniquely American sound. In the summer of 1927, just a few months after his grandson Jim was born, Charles Sr. heard about something extraordinary happening in the nearby town of Bristol, a bustling town that straddled the Tennessee-Virginia state line. A man from the Victor Talking Machine Company in New York, a visionary A&R man named Ralph Peer, had hauled a primitive, portable recording apparatus down from the city and set up a temporary studio in the dusty second floor of an old hat warehouse on State Street. Peer had put an ad in the local paper looking for authentic musicians from the surrounding hills. He wasn't looking for polished professionals. He was looking for the real thing, the raw, unvarnished sound of the mountains. For 2 weeks in late July and early August of 1927, a steady stream of musicians made the pilgrimage to Bristol. They came on foot, on horseback, and in sputtering Model T Fords. Among them were a trio from nearby Maces Spring, Virginia, A.P. Carter, his wife Sarah, and his sister-in-law, Maybelle. They would become immortalized as the Carter family, the first family of country music. A few days later, a tubercular former railroad brakeman from Mississippi named Jimmy Rogers showed up and, in his sessions, created the blueprint for the singing country star with his signature blue yodel. History would come to recognize the 1927 Bristol Sessions as the single most important event in the history of country music, its Big Bang. It was the moment when the private regional folk music of the Appalachians was first captured on wax and prepared for mass dissemination, transforming it into a commercial and cultural force that would sweep the nation. And Charles McReynolds, grandfather of Jim and Jesse, was there. He recorded a fiddle tune, a small, almost forgotten part of that cosmic explosion of creativity. His recording was not a major hit, and his name is often a footnote in the story of Bristol. But that fact is more than a piece of arcane family trivia. It is their origin story. Their grandfather's fiddle was a tuning fork that struck the first defining note of their lives. That high, lonesome sound of Bristol, a sound of sorrow and resilience, was not just an influence. It was their birthright, a sacred chord written directly into their DNA. From their earliest days, it was clear that the two McReynolds brothers were a unit, inseparable yet distinctly, temperamentally different. They were two halves of a single whole, each possessing qualities that complemented the other perfectly. Jim, the elder by 2 years, was quieter, more serious and introspective. He had the steady, responsible nature of a firstborn son. He was a natural leader, not through force of personality, but through a quiet, unwavering competence. When he sang, even as a young boy, his voice was warm, clear, and powerful, with a natural sense of pitch and phrasing. He gravitated toward the guitar, the foundational instrument of their music. He learned the steady rhythmic chords from his father, mastering the art of providing a solid driving foundation for a song. In the musical partnership that was to come, Jim was always the anchor. He was the root of the tree, the sturdy trunk from which everything else could grow. His rhythm was impeccable, his presence reassuring. He was the one who held it all together. Jesse, the younger brother, was the firecracker. He was energetic, endlessly curious, and possessed a restless, inventive spirit that chafed against imitation. While Jim was focused on mastering the song's foundation, Jesse was fascinated by its ornamentation, its melodic possibilities. His chosen instrument was the mandolin. In the 1930s and 40s, the world of the bluegrass mandolin was the undisputed territory of one man, Bill Monroe, the acknowledged father of bluegrass. Monroe played with a ferocious, blues-inflected percussive downstroke. His style was powerful, rhythmic, and virtuosic, and it was so dominant that it was universally imitated. For a young mandolin player, the goal was simply to sound as much like Bill Monroe as possible. But Jesse McReynolds didn't want to imitate. He wanted to invent. From the astonishingly early age of 6, he began to develop a technique that was utterly and uniquely his own. It wasn't a conscious decision to break from tradition. It was the result of a child's pure, uninhibited musical curiosity. Instead of the powerful chopping downstrokes of Monroe, Jesse began experimenting with a fluid, rolling three-finger picking style, using a flat pick on his thumb and his bare index and middle fingers, a motion more akin to the three-finger banjo roll that was being pioneered by players like Snuffy Jenkins and, later, Earl Scruggs. He found that by picking individual notes on different strings in a continuous forward-rolling pattern, he could create a shimmering, uninterrupted cascade of sound. It was a river of melody that could flow around and through a song's chord structure, a stark contrast to the staccato chop of the traditional bluegrass mandolin. While Bill Monroe played the mandolin as if it were a percussive weapon, a woodchopper's axe, Jesse, a 6-year-old boy, taught it to sing. His cross-picking was not an attack. It was a conversation, a technique that transformed the instrument from a rhythmic hammer into a flowing melodic river. It was a quiet revolution, born not of rebellion but of pure, joyful discovery. He was creating a style that would add a new layer of melodic complexity and textural beauty to bluegrass, a style that would go on to influence generations of mandolin players, from David Grisman to Chris Thile. Their musical partnership began as naturally as breathing. Around 1935, when Jim was 8 and Jesse was 6, they started singing together in public, mostly at church services and local community gatherings. Their voices, still high and boyish, blended with a startling, intuitive perfection. It was the kind of harmony that can't be taught, a blood harmony that comes from a shared lifetime of listening to the same cadences of speech, breathing the same air, and being shaped by the same genetic material. By 1940, as teenagers, they were winning local talent shows, their polished act and perfect harmonies making them local celebrities. They were honing their craft in the most organic way possible, through immersion and osmosis. Their main source of musical education was the family's battery-powered radio, their portal to the wider world. They would sit for hours listening to the powerful broadcasts from stations like WSM in Nashville, home of the grand ole Opry. They absorbed the music of the great brother duos of the era, particularly the Monroe Brothers and the Blue Sky Boys. They learned the repertoire, the vocal phrasing, and the song structures. But when they filtered this music through their own unique sensibilities, through Jim's steady guitar and warm lead voice, and through Jesse's revolutionary mandolin style and his high, clear tenor harmony, something new and distinctive emerged. This was the forge. In the poverty and isolation of Appalachia, a sound was being created, a harmony that was at once deeply rooted in tradition and startlingly, brilliantly new. With a sound forged in the isolation of the Appalachian hills, a sound that was both a sacred inheritance and a quiet revolution, the McReynolds brothers were a secret waiting to be told. But for that secret to escape the confines of the Virginia hollers, they needed a bigger stage than the local church or town hall. As America itself roared back to life after the Second World War, the world of music would provide that stage, a world powered by the newfound energy of the road and the far-reaching ambition of the radio. Their apprenticeship was over. The journey was about to begin. As America emerged from the long, dark shadow of the Second World War, the nation seemed to exhale a collective breath it had been holding for years. The immense industrial might that had been focused on winning the war was now turned inward, fueling an unprecedented economic boom. A new sense of optimism, energy, and possibility swept the country. Soldiers returned home, started families, and bought houses in the rapidly expanding suburbs. The highways began to fill with new chrome-laden automobiles, and the airwaves crackled with a newfound confidence. This post-war energy manifested itself in every corner of American culture, and in the world of country music, it took the form of an explosive, high-octane sound that had been simmering in the mountains for years, bluegrass. For over a decade, Bill Monroe and his band, the Bluegrass Boys, had been a popular act on the Grand Ole Opry, playing a hard-driving, blues-infused version of traditional string band music. But in late 1945, the final crucial ingredients fell into place. A young banjo player from North Carolina named Earl Scruggs joined the band, bringing with him a revolutionary three-finger picking style that was as syncopated and explosive as a machine gun. Paired with the soulful guitar runs and lead vocals of Lester Flatt, the powerhouse fiddle of Chubby Wise, and Monroe's own percussive mandolin and piercing tenor voice, this particular configuration of the Bluegrass Boys created a sound that was something entirely new. It was thrilling, complex, and breathtakingly virtuosic. It had the drive of swing music, the soul of the blues, and the ancient heart of the mountains. This was the sound that would be christened bluegrass, and it was about to become a national phenomenon. For young, ambitious musicians in the Appalachian region like Jim and Jesse McReynolds, this was a pivotal moment. The music they had grown up with was no longer just the private language of their community. It was the next big thing. And the primary conduits for this new sound, the cathedrals where its gospel was preached, were the powerful radio stations that dotted the landscape. While WSM in Nashville was the undisputed Vatican of country music, a network of powerful regional stations served as the essential seminaries, the places where a young act could learn their craft, build an audience, and perhaps, if they were good enough, get a shot at the big time. Stations like WPTF in Raleigh, WDBJ in Roanoke, and the legendary Wheeling Jamboree broadcast on WWVA in West Virginia became king makers. But for a duo from Southwest Virginia, the most important of all was WCYB in Bristol. Starting in 1946, WCYB began broadcasting a daily lunchtime show called Farm and Fun Time. It became an incubator for some of the most important first-generation bluegrass acts in history. The Stanley Brothers, Lester Flatt, and Earl Scruggs, after they left Monroe Mac Wiseman. They all used Farm and Fun Time as their home base. The show's powerful signal beamed their raw, authentic mountain music throughout Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and North Carolina. For a young duo like the McReynolds brothers, getting a spot on WCYB was the only conceivable path to a professional career. Starting in 1946, Jim and Jesse, now officially billed as Jim and Jesse and the Virginia Boys, became regulars on these programs. This was their formal entry into the life of the professional touring musician, and it was a grueling, unforgiving apprenticeship. The reality of the road in the late 1940s bore no resemblance to the polished tour buses of later eras. It meant cramming themselves, their instruments, and their bandmates into a single, often unreliable sedan. It meant navigating the treacherous, winding two-lane mountain roads of the Appalachian region, roads that were often unpaved and unforgiving, long before the interstate highway system smoothed the way. Their daily routine was a relentless grind. They would typically play a live show on the radio in the morning or at noon, the payment for which was often just the talent fee from the station and the right to advertise their personal appearances. Then they would pile back into the car and drive for hours, sometimes hundreds of miles over those winding roads, to that evening's show. The venues were rarely glamorous. They played in stuffy schoolhouse auditoriums, VFW and American Legion halls, the backlots of drive-in movie theaters, and town squares. The crowds could be small and indifferent or large and enthusiastic. The pay was often meager, sometimes just a percentage of the ticket sales at the door. After the show, they would either drive through the night to the next town or pile into a cheap roadside hotel, 4 or 5 men to a room, to catch a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again the next day. This life was a crucible that forged or broke a musician. It demanded immense physical stamina and mental fortitude. It taught them how to connect with an audience, how to win over a skeptical crowd, and how to deliver a flawless performance even when they were exhausted, hungry, and homesick. It was during this intense period of woodshedding that Jim and Jesse truly solidified their musical identity and their public image. In a genre that was increasingly defined by its raw, high, lonesome edge, the almost painful emotional intensity of the Stanley Brothers, the ferocious drive of Bill Monroe, Jim and Jesse cultivated a different aesthetic. They were building a reputation not as fiery, hard-driving bluegrass rebels, but as the gentlemen of the genre. Their image was one of clean-cut, unimpeachable professionalism. On stage, they wore matching suits and ties, their shoes were shined, and their hair was neatly combed. Their performances were models of understated precision and elegance. There was no grandstanding, no overt showmanship. They simply stood, played, and sang with a quiet confidence that let the music speak for itself. And that music was becoming increasingly distinct. Their sound was defined by its clarity, its smoothness, and its sheer beauty. Jim's lead vocal was the heart of their music, a warm, rich, and confident baritone that was both powerful and soothing. He was the narrator, the storyteller, the steady hand on the tiller. Jesse's intricate, cascading mandolin work was the dazzling ornamentation, a constant stream of melodic invention that was unlike anything else in the genre. And when he added his high, perfect tenor harmony to Jim's lead, the effect was mesmerizing. Their voices locked together with an intuitive, genetic precision that created a third, ethereal voice. They were creating a unique niche for themselves, a sound that was as elegant and refined as it was deeply and authentically rooted in the traditions of the mountains. They were the velvet glove of bluegrass. By the early 1950s, the years of grinding it out on the road had begun to pay off. The name Jim and Jesse was gaining traction beyond the confines of Appalachia. Record labels, the ultimate arbiters of success, began to take notice. In 1951, they made their first recordings, a collection of 4 gospel songs for the small, independent Kentucky Records label. These recordings, raw and simply produced, perfectly captured the sound they had honed in churches and on small radio stations. The sound of their mother's faith filtered through their unique musical chemistry. The following year, they took the next monumental step up the ladder, signing their first major recording contract with the mighty Capitol Records in Hollywood. This was the big leagues. Capitol was the label of stars like Tex Ritter, Tennessee Ernie Ford, and Merle Travis. For 2 boys from a Virginia coal camp, this was the validation of their dreams. The future seemed bright, the path to national stardom clear and unobstructed. They were on the cusp of everything they had worked for. And then history, as it so often does, intervened. In June of 1950, the world had been plunged into a new and brutal conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The Cold War had turned hot, and the United States military needed soldiers. A draft was instituted, and young men from every corner of the country were being called to serve. In 1952, a draft notice arrived at the McReynolds home. It was addressed to Jesse. The perfect harmony was about to be broken. For 2 years, while Jesse served on the front lines in Korea, the musical partnership ceased to exist. Jim was left to carry on alone, a devastating blow to the momentum they had built. This period was one of immense uncertainty and fear. Jim continued to perform, determined to keep the name alive. He worked as a solo act and played with other musicians, including a stint with Mac Wiseman's band. He was a placeholder, a lonely vigil keeper, waiting and praying for his brother's safe return. One can only imagine what this forced separation felt like for 2 brothers who had been musically and personally intertwined since early childhood. It was the first time they had ever been truly apart. For Jesse, it was an immersion into a world of unimaginable violence and chaos. The sensitive, creative young man who had spent his life coaxing beautiful melodies from a small wooden instrument was now a soldier in a foreign land, surrounded by the constant threat of death. He continued to play music, entertaining the troops with his mandolin when he could, a small reminder of home and sanity in the midst of war. But the experience would inevitably leave an indelible mark on his soul. For Jim, it was a test of his resolve and his faith in their shared dream. Every day brought with it the gnawing anxiety of not knowing if his brother was safe, if their partnership would ever be resumed. This interruption, this period of forced silence and separation would ultimately serve to deepen their appreciation for their unique partnership. It was a stark, terrifying reminder that their harmony was not just a musical arrangement. It was the central defining relationship of their lives, and it was fragile. When Jesse finally and safely returned home in 1954, they picked up right where they had left off. But they were not the same people. The reunion was undoubtedly joyous, but it was also layered with the weight of their experiences. They were no longer just talented boys with a dream. They were young men who had been hardened by the world, who understood the precious, fragile nature of life and of their extraordinary gift. This newfound maturity and emotional depth was immediately apparent in their music. They resumed their contract with Capitol Records, and their recordings from this post-war period showcase a deeper emotional resonance. Songs like their beautiful rendition of "I Will Be Waiting for You" were no longer just sentimental love songs. They were imbued with a palpable sense of longing and relief, born from real-life experience. The years of hardship and separation had added a new layer of pathos to their art. The perfect harmony was back, but now it carried within it the unmistakable echo of loss, resilience, and the profound joy of reunion. The foundation for their golden age had been laid, solidified not just by musical genius, but by the crucible of real life. Having survived the crucible of war and the profound loneliness of separation, Jim and Jesse were reunited not as boys with a dream, but as men forged by experience. Their harmony, now seasoned with a depth that only hardship can provide, was stronger and more resonant than ever. They had proven their resilience. But to truly claim their place in the pantheon of country music, their journey would have to take them from the winding mountain roads of their youth to the very heart of the industry itself, to a city that was rapidly becoming the undisputed capital of their sound, Nashville. By the mid-1950s, a fundamental shift was occurring in the landscape of American country music. The old model, which had sustained Jim and Jesse and dozens of other acts for the better part of a decade, the life of the regional radio star, barnstorming a specific territory tied to a station's broadcast signal, was beginning to wane. The rise of television was starting to homogenize American culture, and the music industry itself was centralizing. To ascend from being a respected regional act to a true national star, it became clear that all roads now led to one place, Nashville, Tennessee. In the 1950s, Nashville was undergoing a profound transformation. It was consciously and deliberately branding itself as Music City, USA, the undisputed capital of the country music world. This wasn't just a marketing slogan, it was a reality being built in brick and mortar and on vinyl. A neighborhood of unassuming houses and small office buildings near downtown was rapidly being converted into a nerve center of recording studios, publishing houses, and management offices, a district that would soon be known globally as Music Row. This is where the deals were made, where the hits were written, and where careers were forged. The spiritual and cultural heart of this entire ecosystem was a former gospel tabernacle, an old brick building with uncomfortable wooden pews and astonishing acoustics, the Ryman Auditorium. This was the home of the Grand Ole Opry. To have a hit record was one thing, but to be a member of the Opry was something else entirely. It was an induction into the royal family of country music. Broadcast live every Saturday night over the Clear Channel, 50,000-watt signal of WSMAM, the Opry was more than a radio show. It was a cultural institution, a sacred stage. Its signal could be picked up across 38 states and parts of Canada, reaching millions of listeners and turning its cast members into household names. For a country musician, performing on the Ryman stage was the ultimate goal, the Holy Grail. It was a sign that you had truly arrived. For Jim and Jesse, the decision was clear. The years of driving the winding roads of Appalachia had been their university, but to earn their master's degree, they had to go to the source. In 1956, they packed their belongings and made the pilgrimage to Nashville. Their arrival was not that of conquering heroes, but of hopeful supplicants, albeit highly skilled ones, with a growing reputation. The city was teeming with talent, a fiercely competitive environment where hundreds of ambitious singers and pickers were vying for the same limited spotlight. Their polished, professional, and deeply authentic sound, however, quickly found a receptive audience. They began making guest appearances on the Grand Ole Opry, a nerve-wracking but essential step in the long process of becoming a member. Stepping onto the Ryman stage for the first time was an experience that left even the most seasoned performers in awe. You were literally standing on the same spot where Hank Williams had sung, where Bill Monroe had created Bluegrass, where Roy Acuff had reigned as king. You could feel the ghosts of the music in the very floorboards. Jim and Jesse, with their clean-cut image and their elegant, precise musicianship, were a perfect fit for the Opry's family-friendly but musically exacting standards. They weren't the wild, unpredictable honky-tonk singers. They were ambassadors of the music's more refined, traditional on-seat side. The years between their arrival in Nashville and their ultimate coronation were a period of relentless work. They became part of the fabric of the Nashville music scene, earning the respect of their peers. Fellow musicians in particular were awed by their talent. Guitar players would watch in admiration of Jim's smooth, powerful vocals and his rock-steady rhythm, and mandolin players would gather in the wings, their jaws agape, as they watched Jesse's fingers fly across the fretboard, producing that shimmering, cascading sound that no one else could replicate. They were the connoisseur's choice, the duo that other artists would stop and listen to, marveling at the sheer perfection of their harmony and the breathtaking innovation of their instrumental work. In 1960, their career took another massive leap forward when they signed a new and far more lucrative recording contract with Epic Records. This was a major label, a subsidiary of the giant Columbia Records, and it was a partnership that signaled a deep commitment to showcasing their unique talents. This deal would usher in their golden age, a period of prolific and brilliant recording that would produce the core of their legacy. They released a series of landmark albums that are now considered classics of the bluegrass genre. Albums like Bluegrass Special and Bluegrass Classics were masterclasses in the form, featuring the quintessential Jim and Jesse sound, Jim's warm, authoritative lead vocal on timeless story songs, Jesse's revolutionary, cross-picking, weaving, intricate tapestries of melody, and those impossibly tight, intuitive brother harmonies that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They also honored their roots with beautiful gospel collections, like the Old Country Church, music that connected them back to their mother's voice in that small chapel in Carfax. Their reputation grew, not through a string of explosive crossover pop hits, but through a steady, relentless dedication to their craft and a consistent presence on the most important stage in the genre. They became one of the Opry's most popular and reliable guest acts. And finally, in March of 1964, after nearly 8 years of paying their dues in Music City, the call they had been working toward their entire lives finally came. Live on the air, from the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, Jim and Jesse and the Virginia Boys were officially invited to become members of the Grand Ole Opry. It was their coronation, the ultimate recognition. The two boys from the coal dust of Virginia had taken their rightful place among the immortals of country music. The mid to late 1960s represented their commercial and creative zenith. As official members of the Grand Ole Opry, they were now part of a nationally syndicated television show and a touring machine that took them across the country and eventually around the world. While they never achieved the kind of chart-topping pop crossover success of contemporaries like Eddie Arnold or Sonny James, within the kingdom of bluegrass, they were royalty. They released a string of popular and influential albums for Epic, including innovative concept records built around quintessentially American themes of work, trains, and faith. Albums like Diesel, On My Tail, and We Like Trains were not just collections of songs, but cohesive artistic statements that showcased their storytelling prowess. Visually, they embraced the pageantry of the era. They were frequently seen in magnificent rhinestone-studded suits created by the legendary tailor Nudie Cohn of Hollywood. These nudie suits, with their elaborate embroidered patterns of wagons, flowers, and musical notes, were the unofficial uniform of the successful country star, a vibrant, larger-than-life expression of the music itself. For two men who came from a world of profound scarcity, these glittering outfits were a powerful symbol of how far they had come. But beneath the traditional sparkling surface of their image, a quiet revolution was always at play. This was the central paradox and the genius of Jim and Jesse. They were simultaneously master preservationists and restless innovators. Jesse, in particular, possessed a creative spirit that could not be confined by the strict, unwritten rules of the bluegrass traditionalists. He was constantly tinkering, experimenting, and pushing the boundaries of the genre. He adapted his groundbreaking cross-picking technique to the electric mandolin, a move that was seen as near blasphemy by the acoustic purists who dominated the genre. He was one of the first in the deeply traditional world of bluegrass to eagerly embrace modern recording techniques like overdubbing, allowing him to layer his intricate mandolin parts and create even richer sonic textures. Perhaps their most famous, audacious, and controversial experiment came in 1965. In a move that was completely out of left field, they released a tribute album to one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. The album was called Berry Pickin' in the Country, and it was an entire collection of Chuck Berry songs, anthems of teenage rebellion and automotive freedom like Maybelline, Johnny B. Good, and Memphis, Tennessee, rearranged for a traditional bluegrass band. To understand how radical this was, one must understand the cultural climate of the time. To many in the conservative adult world of country and bluegrass, rock and roll was the enemy. It was loud, rebellious, and musically simplistic jungle music. For a respected Grand Ole Opry member bluegrass act to pay homage to one of its chief architects was unthinkable. For the purists, this was heresy. It was a betrayal of the music's sacred traditions. But for those who were listening closely without prejudice, the album was a work of understated genius. Jim and Jesse brilliantly demonstrated the deep shared genetic material that connected country, rhythm and blues, and early rock and roll. They revealed the blues-based chord structures and the narrative storytelling core that lay hidden beneath Chuck Berry's electric guitar riffs. Jesse's mandolin, in particular, was a revelation, flawlessly translating Berry's iconic guitar licks into the language of bluegrass with a joyful, virtuosic flair. The album was a brilliant reminder that Jim and Jesse were never just museum curators, blindly preserving the past in amber. They were active, vital, and curious artists, constantly building bridges and exploring the vast, interconnected landscape of American music in their own quiet, gentlemanly way. What is perhaps most remarkable about this period of intense creative output and commercial success is what was happening, or rather what wasn't happening, in their personal lives. Their story during this period is notable for its profound lack of drama. This was the era when country music was solidifying its reputation for hard-living, hard-drinking stars. The tragic decline of Hank Williams was still a fresh memory. The tabloids were filled with the stormy exploits of George Jones and Tammy Wynette. Johnny Cash was battling his own well-publicized demons. The tortured artist was a powerful and popular archetype. Jim and Jesse would have none of it. They were, by all accounts, devoted family men. They were married to their respective sweethearts, raising their children away from the glare of the spotlight. They were men of faith. When they were on the road, they conducted themselves with an unwavering professionalism. They showed up on time. They were sober. They were courteous to the promoters and the fans. And they delivered a flawless, polished performance night after night, year after year. Their lack of public scandal, their steadfast refusal to play the part of the tortured artist, may have made them less compelling to the gossip columnists and the myth makers of the music industry. But within the industry itself, it earned them a deep and abiding respect that few of their more volatile peers could claim. Their rebellion was a quiet one, but it was a rebellion nonetheless. It was a rebellion against the chaos and self-destruction that was consuming so many of their contemporaries. It was a rebellion of dignity, of steadfastness, of loyalty, and of grace. They inherited a sacred trust from their grandfather at the dawn of country music, and at the height of their fame, they proved every single night that they were worthy carriers of that tradition, both on the stage and off. At the very peak of their powers, Jim and Jesse were the embodiment of bluegrass elegance and quiet dignity. They had achieved the dream they had chased since childhood. Membership in the Grand Ole Opry, a string of classic albums, and the deep, abiding respect of their peers. They were a fixed star in the Nashville firmament. But in the fickle world of popular music, the ground is always shifting beneath your feet. As the cultural and sonic landscape of the 1970s began to change around them, the gentlemen of bluegrass would face their greatest challenges yet, a battle not only for their place in an evolving industry, but a far more personal and profound battle for life itself. As the 1960s, a decade of immense cultural upheaval and creative energy, gave way to the 1970s, the American musical landscape began to shift once again, subtly but irrevocably. The raw electric energy of the Bakersfield sound, which had been a powerful counter-narrative to Nashville's Polish, was beginning to soften. The traditional elegance of bluegrass, while still deeply respected by its core audience, was being pushed further from the commercial center. The airwaves of mainstream country radio were being filled with a new, slicker, and more pop-oriented sound. This was the dawning of the countrypolitan era. Led by producers like Billy Sherrill in Nashville, this new sound smoothed out country music's rough edges. The mournful fiddles and twangy steel guitars of the honky-tonk era were often replaced by lush string sections, full vocal choruses, and sophisticated arrangements that borrowed heavily from mainstream pop music. The goal was crossover appeal, to reach a broader, more suburban audience who might not have connected with the genre's more rustic roots. Stars like Charlie Rich, Tammy Wynette, and Charlie Pride dominated the charts with songs that were emotionally powerful, but also radio-friendly, and polished to a high sheen. Simultaneously, a new wave of artists began to blur the lines between folk pop and country. Singer-songwriters like John Denver and Chris Christopherson brought a new lyrical introspection to the genre, while pop singers like Olivia Newton-John and Anne Murray found massive success by recording country-flavored pop songs. For a traditional, acoustic-based bluegrass act like Jim and Jesse, the tide was inexorably going out. The space on the radio playlist for their brand of pure, elegant harmony and virtuosic picking was shrinking by the day. The size of the venues they played began to contract, shifting from larger concert halls back to the bluegrass festivals, college auditoriums, and community centers that were the heartland of their loyal but niche audience. This was not a sudden, catastrophic fall from grace. It was a slow, gentle, inexorable fading of the mainstream spotlight. They continued to be beloved members of the Grand Ole Opry, their weekly performances a comforting touchstone of authenticity for the show's dedicated listeners. They continued to tour and record, but the pressures of the changing industry were undeniable. For many artists of their generation, this kind of commercial decline could lead to bitterness, creative compromise, or a desperate attempt to chase trends. For Jim and Jesse, it simply meant a redoubling of their commitment to the music they believed in, a quiet determination to continue their craft with the same dignity and professionalism they had always embodied. And then, just as they were navigating these challenging professional crosscurrents, their private struggles took on a new and terrifying dimension, one that would dwarf any concerns about record sales or radio airplay. In 1975, Jim McReynolds, the anchor, the man with the powerful, unwavering voice, the steady presence at the heart of their sound, was diagnosed with cancer. The battle that followed was a long, private, and arduous one. In an era before celebrity health struggles were openly discussed, Jim faced his diagnosis with the same quiet, steadfast determination he had brought to every other aspect of his life. He underwent major surgery and grueling treatments, fighting the disease with a profound inner strength. This was the true ultimate test of their partnership, a challenge that went far beyond music and business. Jesse, whose own health was also beginning to show the wear and tear of a lifetime on the road, became his brother's steadfast support. The bond that had been forged in childhood, tested by war, and celebrated on the world's biggest stages now became a lifeline. They continued to tour, albeit on a reduced and carefully managed schedule that accommodated Jim's treatments and recovery. For Jim, the act of performing, of standing on stage next to his brother and creating that perfect harmony, was not a burden. It was a form of therapy, a powerful affirmation of life. The performances themselves took on a new, poignant, and almost sacred weight. For the audiences who knew of Jim's struggle, watching them on stage was an act of bearing witness to incredible courage. The songs of faith they had sung their entire lives, hymns learned at their mother's knee like "The Old Country Church" and "I'll Fly Away," were no longer just songs. They were now a living testament to a very real and personal struggle with mortality. Their harmony, always technically perfect, now carried within its beautiful resonance the unmistakable, heartbreaking echo of human fragility. Every note was precious, a quiet defiance against the silence that threatened to fall. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Jim and Jesse gracefully settled into the revered role of elder statesmen of bluegrass. The mainstream country music world had moved on, now dominated by the new traditionalist movement of stars like George Strait and Randy Travis, who in turn gave way to the stadium-sized spectacle of Garth Brooks. Jim and Jesse were no longer chasing hits, but they were more beloved than ever by those who cherished the music's deep roots. They were living legends, a direct link back to the genre's foundational moments. They continued to record, releasing albums on independent labels that celebrated their long career and their enduring love for the music. They were a constant, comforting presence at bluegrass festivals across the country, where they were treated with the reverence reserved for founding fathers. Fans who had listened to them on the radio in the 1950s now brought their children and grandchildren to see them, passing the tradition down through the generations. In 1993, they were inducted into the International Bluegrass Music Association's Hall of Honor, a formal recognition of their status as architects of the genre. Then, in 1997. They received one of the nation's most prestigious cultural awards, the National Heritage Fellowship, presented by the National Endowment for the Arts. This award, the United States' highest honor for folk and traditional arts, was a fitting tribute to a lifetime spent not just preserving their craft, but actively innovating within it. It was a recognition that their contribution to American culture was as significant and enduring as that of any blues singer, jazz pioneer, or folk archivist. All the while, Jim's private battle with cancer continued. It was a long, slow war of attrition. He fought it for more than 2.5 decades, defying doctors' predictions year after year. His sheer will to live, to continue to sing, and to stand on a stage beside his brother seemed to be a powerful form of medicine. There were periods of remission and periods of intense struggle, but through it all, the partnership endured. Jesse was his constant, his road companion, his harmony partner, and his caregiver. The 55-year musical conversation they had been having since childhood continued, now imbued with a profound sense of borrowed time. But it was a battle he could not ultimately win. In the final months of 2002, Jim's health declined sharply. The long fight was coming to its end. On the very last day of the year, December 31st, 2002, James Monroe McReynolds passed away with his brother Jesse by his side. He was 75 years old. The partnership, the harmony, the unbroken circle that had lasted for 55 years was finally, irrevocably broken. For 55 uninterrupted years, the story of Jim and Jesse was the story of an unbreakable circle. It was a narrative defined by two halves of a perfect whole, a constant harmony against the silence of the world. With Jim's passing, that circle was shattered. The harmony fell silent. And for the one left behind, a profound and daunting question remained. What happens when the echo is all you have left? The final unexpected chapter of this remarkable story would belong to Jesse alone, a journey through grief, a testament to memory, and a final brilliant flash of the innovative spirit that had always burned within. What happens when one half of a perfect, indivisible whole is gone? For Jesse McReynolds, the silence that descended on the first day of 2003 must have been absolute and deafening. It was more than the absence of a voice. It was the absence of a fundamental law of his universe. For 73 years, from the shared bedroom of their childhood home to the hallowed stage of the Ryman Auditorium to the anonymous hotel rooms of a life spent on the road, the presence of his older brother Jim had been his constant. Jim was his musical North Star, his steadying rhythm, his other voice. Now, that presence was an echo in his memory, and the silence in its place was a vast, uncharted territory. In the days and weeks following Jim's passing, the bluegrass world mourned the loss of a giant and quietly assumed that an era had definitively closed. The story of Jim and Jesse, a beautiful and complete narrative spanning 55 years, was now finished. It was a reasonable assumption. Many in the industry expected Jesse, then in his mid-70s and with his own health concerns, to retire gracefully, to hang up the mandolin, accept the accolades, and live out his days as a revered patriarch of the genre. How could he possibly continue? To stand on a stage alone would be to perform with a phantom, to sing a harmony with a ghost. The very name of the act, the brand they had built for over half a century, was a testament to a partnership that no longer existed. They were wrong. The decision for Jesse to continue was not born of professional ambition or financial necessity. It was born of something far deeper, a profound, unwavering sense of loyalty, and a sacred duty to keep the music alive. To stop performing would be to allow the silence to win, To put the mandolin away would be a second death, an admission that the music of Jim and Jesse had died with Jim. And that was something Jesse could not and would not allow. He would continue not in spite of his brother's absence, but because of it. He would become the sole keeper of the flame, the last Virginia boy, the living embodiment of their shared legacy. His first musical statement after his brother's death was a heartbreakingly beautiful and appropriately titled tribute album, "'Tis Sweet to Be Remembered." The title track, an old Mac Wiseman song they had often performed, now took on an almost unbearable poignancy. It was no longer just a song about memory. It was a mission statement, a prayer, a public declaration of Jesse's new purpose. The album was a tender and elegiac journey through their shared history, filled with the songs they loved, performed with a quiet grace and a palpable sense of loss. He returned to the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, the place that had been their professional home for nearly 4 decades. The first time he stepped into the famous circle of wood on the Ryman stage alone was a moment of immense emotional weight for both him and the audience. He was a solitary figure now, his posture as dignified as ever, his mandolin still in hand. But the empty space beside him, where Jim had always stood, was a physical manifestation of the void. A spare microphone was often placed on stage next to him, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the man who was no longer there to sing into it. He would sing his part, and in the space where Jim's warm baritone should have been, there was only the collective memory of the audience. Every note Jesse played, every line he sang, was an act of remembrance. He was no longer just performing music. He was communing with his brother's spirit in the only way he knew how. For several years, Jesse carried on in this new role, the beloved curator of the Jim and Jesse legacy. He toured with his own version of the Virginia Boys. His performance is a beautiful and moving tribute to the music he and his brother had created together. He was a living legend, and for many this would have been a more than sufficient final chapter to a magnificent career. But Jesse McReynolds, the quiet innovator, the 6-year-old boy who refused to simply copy Bill Monroe, had one more astonishing creative act left in him. In 2010, at the age of 81, he did something so completely unexpected, so creatively audacious, that it sent a ripple of surprise and delight through the American music community. He released an album called Songs of the Grateful Dead, a tribute to Jerry Garcia and Robert Hunter. On the surface, the project seemed baffling. What could a first-generation bluegrass master, a gentleman from the old school of country music, possibly have in common with the psychedelic, free-form, counterculture rock and roll of the Grateful Dead? But for those who understood the deep, interconnected root system of American music, the connection was not as strange as it seemed. The Grateful Dead's late leader, Jerry Garcia, had begun his own musical journey, not as a rock guitarist, but as a devoted bluegrass banjo picker. He revered the first-generation masters like Earl Scruggs and the Stanley Brothers. The Dead's music, for all its electric improvisation, was deeply infused with the storytelling harmonies and song structures of old-time country, folk, and bluegrass music. Jesse's album was a work of startling originality and brilliant musical translation. He wasn't simply playing rock songs on acoustic instruments. He was diving deep into the intricate folk-based melodies of Garcia and the mythic story song lyrics of Robert Hunter and reimagining them entirely within the bluegrass vernacular. The iconic loping bass line of Franklin's Tower was transformed into a driving bluegrass rhythm. The mournful plea of Black Muddy River became a high, lonesome ballad that could have echoed through the Virginia hills a century ago. On Ripple, he used his signature cross-picking to weave a delicate, shimmering tapestry of sound that perfectly captured the song's gentle, philosophical spirit. The album was a critical triumph, celebrated for its artistry and its adventurous spirit. It was a stunning bridge built between two seemingly disparate worlds of American music, revealing their shared soul. More than that, it was a final, powerful declaration from the quiet innovator. It was a statement that his creative spirit, the same spirit that led him to invent a new way to play the mandolin as a child, had not been dimmed by age or extinguished by grief. It was the final, brilliant act of the firecracker, a man whose musical curiosity refused to be silenced. Jesse McReynolds continued to perform for another decade, a beloved and seemingly timeless figure on the Opry stage. He finally passed away on June 23, 2023, just weeks shy of his 94th birthday. The last Virginia boy had gone home. The book was finally, completely closed. So what, then, is the final legacy of Jim and Jesse McReynolds? It is not a story of drama or of tragedy in the traditional self-destructive sense that defines so many musical biographies. It is a story of something far rarer and perhaps far more profound, a story of endurance. Theirs was a legacy of quiet dignity, of unwavering professionalism in an industry that often rewards chaos, and of a brotherly bond that was never, ever broken by the usual corrosives of fame, money, or ego. Musically, their contributions are monumental and undeniable. Jesse's cross-picking technique permanently expanded the melodic and textural vocabulary of the mandolin, influencing nearly every significant player who came after him. And together, their harmony remains the gold standard, a benchmark of that intuitive genetic perfection that can only be described as blood harmony. But their human story is just as significant. It stands as a quiet reminder that the most powerful narratives are not always the loudest. It is a testament to a different kind of rebellion, a rebellion against the self-destruction and melodrama of the music industry, a rebellion of steadfastness, of loyalty, of faith, and of grace. They inherited a sacred trust from their grandfather, a spark from the big bang of country music in that dusty Bristol warehouse, and for 55 years they carried that trust with unwavering honor. So, what was the secret cure? Perhaps there was no cure, only a choice to value brotherhood over business, loyalty over legacy, and peace over perfection. Their harmony was perfect not because they were flawless, but because they were whole. And in a world of broken brotherhoods, that is the most revolutionary sound of all.